all students at ISB between grades 2 and 10 take MAP growth tests at least twice per year. These results are shared at the end of the year with parents. This is a quick guide for how to interpret the results of the MAP growth assessment. Before we begin, there are a few key terms you needed to know in order to help you interpret your child's MAP results. Firstly, the RIT score. The RIT score is essentially the number of points your child has scored on the MAP assessment. The number of points a child can receive depends on how many questions they get right and how difficult each question is. The MAP assessment is adaptive, which means the more questions your child answers correctly, the more challenging the questions become. The more questions they answer incorrectly, the easier the questions become. The RIT score is a continuous score across all grade levels with standard distances between each number. It's kind of like marking your child's height on a growth chart on a wall every year using a standard scale in centimeters. The wall chart shows how tall your child is and how much they've grown from birthday to birthday. With RIT scores, you can see how much mathematical knowledge and skill they've mastered and how much they've grown between tests. Next is percentile. A percentile is a scale based on 100. For example, if a student has a score in the 60th percentile, that means that their score is better than or equal to 60% of all the students who took the assessment at that grade level. Please note it does not mean that they got 60% of the questions correct. Next is standard error. Standard error is a statistical tool that helps us understand how reliable the test scores are. You've all had the experience of walking out of a test and kicking yourself for missing a question you actually knew the answer to. Our performance on any given day and time depends on so many different things. So, for example, if a student had a RIT score of 220 points and the standard error was plus or minus 3, it means there's a possibility that if they were to retake the assessment again on a different day or at a different time, they may have scored anywhere between 217 and 223. This is very important to keep in mind when looking at scores. Over time, this will even out. But as we'll see later when we look at a student example, it's possible that the standard error can make it appear that a student has temporarily gone backward when actually they have not. The last term is projection. Projections are based on MAP's normative data. MAP takes your child's current score, then adds the average increase of RIT scores from students in the norm group at the same grade level across the same time period. In a nutshell, if your child increases their score at a similar rate to others in the same grade level, then they'll get the score in the projection bar. Obviously, every child's different. So while the growth projections are a very useful tool, we should always interpret them as guidelines, not as fixed expectations. When you open your child's report, you'll see a few main features. First is the subject area at the top left. For all students in grades 2 to 10, at ISB, you should see scores for mathematics. Some grades also take other appropriate tests. These scores will include a line graph just below the subject title with 3 differently colored lines. On the bottom left, you will see a list of the major domains within the subject area, in this case mathematics. And to the right, you'll see a summary table that includes all the scores for your child's time at ISB. Let's take a look at each of these more closely, one at a time. So, firstly, the graph. The graph only shows test scores from the last 2 academic years. There are 3 differently colored lines. Your child's scores will be shown in blue. The average score for all students within the same grade level at ISB will be shown in orange. The average scores for students in the MAP norm group within the same grade level will be shown as a yellow line. The norms are mostly made up of schools from the United States. While there are hundreds of international schools that use MAP growth assessment, the majority of schools come from the United States. You may notice that your child's score, the blue line, shows peaks and valleys, which makes it appear that they've gone backwards at some points. This pattern is typical and is nothing to worry about. Dips are sometimes seen between spring and fall when students are on summer break. The dips sometimes also just reflect the standard measurement error we looked at earlier. You see the dip here in this child's score. What's most important is the trend over time. So as you can see with this student, there's an apparent dip in the fall of 2018 but between fall of 2017 and spring of 2019, the student has made steady growth overall. Next, from the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see the content domains. Depending on the subject area, you'll see different content area domains, anywhere between 3 and 5 different categories. Within these, your child will have a score. The score is based on the child's performance, scored as a percentile within each of the area domains. The words indicate low, low average, average, high average, or high, based on that percentile. In the summary table, you'll see all of your child's data during their time at ISB. First, you'll notice the school year. FA is for fall or autumn, WI is for winter, and SP is for spring, followed by the year the test was taken. Some grades at ISB take the test 3 times a year and others twice a year, so you may not always see a score for the winter testing period. In the second column, you'll see the grade your child was in when they took that particular test. In the third column, you'll see your child's RIT score. This column also includes the standard error we discussed earlier. So for example, in the spring of 2019, this child's RIT score was 235, but there's a possibility that if they had sat the test a second time on a different day, they may have scored between 232 and 238. In the next 2 columns, you'll see your child's RIT growth and their growth projection. These numbers are only entered for the spring testing window. They show the number of RIT points your child actually grew across the school year from the fall testing window to the spring testing window, compared with the projected growth, which MAP's data norms predicted they would grow. Remember from our definitions that the projection was based on an average of the amount of growth students in the same grade generally make over that period. So if we look at this student, between the fall of 2018 and the spring of 2019, they grew 6 points. And they were predicted to grow 6 points. This means they grew at the same rate one would expect for a student at that same grade level. The previous year, the student made more growth than is typical across that year. In some cases, you may notice RIT growth that's below the projection. There are many possible reasons that might explain this. One reason could be the standard error. For example, let's say this child only grew 7 points instead of the predicted 9. The standard error of plus or minus 3 here suggests they could have grown between 6 and 12 points. So, to recap the idea of standard error, if the child had sat the test the next day, it's entirely possible they might have met their growth projection. For this reason, it's important not to focus too much on any single total score. From a parental perspective, it's the long-term trend which is most important. Teachers can also gather other information from the testing, such as relative areas of strength and weakness within the subject. Together, We can use this data and the data we collect, the other data we collect about your child's progress, to help us plan their next steps in learning.